Welcome to the Skift podcast, weekly conversations on global travel trend lines. I'm your host, Hannah Sampson. You should really think about going to the South Bronx this year, or Dubrovnik, Croatia. Don't forget Egypt, and also Canada, all of it. If those places sound familiar, you were probably reading travel stories in the New York Times or Bloomberg recently. Every year, those and other publications come up with a list of places to visit that get dissected and discussed at length, including recently at Skift for pretty much an entire day. On today's episode of the Skift podcast, we're talking about a very specific form of travel advice, the where to go in the coming year list, and what goes into making them. Our guests are Dan Saltzstein, a travel editor at the New York Times, who organized the 52 Places to Go in 2017 project for the Times. And we also have Nikki Ekstein, travel editor at Bloomberg Pursuits, who oversaw Bloomberg's Where to Go in 2017 list. They're here with me, Skift podcast host and editor Hannah Sampson, and editor-in-chief Jason Clampett. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just dive right in, and we'll start with you, Dan. Can you walk me through the process a little bit? Do you try to consider what other places might pick and avoid those? Do you send reporters to check out a place before you pick it? Tell me how you put this list together.
No and no, but I will tell you how the rest of it goes. So we start earlier and earlier every year. It just gets more and more complicated. So this year we started, I think, in sort of mid-September, sort of conceptualizing what we wanted to do for the list. This is our 12th year doing the list, but sort of our maybe 5th or 6th doing it sort of in this format. The first thing we do is basically reach out to all of our regular contributors, many of whom are based overseas or travel the world, certainly more than we do as editors stuck behind computers, and get their sense of where. We basically ask them, where would you send somebody in the coming year? So not just where's a great place to travel, but where's a great place to travel this year? And we get hundreds and hundreds of pitches in. And at a certain point, we have a marathon meeting amongst the editors in the travel section, which lasts for hours and gets progressively more and more punchy as we go along. And we sort of look for a few different things. One is that same sort of why now question. Another is a sort of eye towards having a diversity, both geographic and thematic, across the list. So places around the world, but also places for food lovers, for art lovers, for budget travelers, etc. And places that are sort of maybe a combination of places that are emerging in some way that people may not be thinking about, maybe a slightly counterintuitive. South Bronx would, I think, fall into that category. And also places that people may not have even heard of, which there are a couple on this list that I had literally never heard of and was sort of amazed to read about them. So we don't send the reporters to report on them, but they do sort of report them out and try to find as much specific information as they can before we assign them out.
Mm-hmm. And how's it go, Bloomberg, Nikki?
Well, very different to the New York Times. This was actually our first time doing a list like this. Bloomberg Pursuits is a really young brand. We've only been around for a couple of years. And when I came on last May, I was the first travel editor to be hired at Bloomberg Pursuits. And I'm the only person who works on travel content in a dedicated fashion. So unlike you guys at the Times who have a team and can kind of dissect all of these pitches, and you have a long list of writers who contribute to you guys, what we're doing is really kind of scrappy and startup-like in its nature. So our process differs for reasons that stem from that. I tried to start my list in September. That's when I kind of pitched the concept, and I said, this is a space that Bloomberg can really jump into. But the back and forth with our development team actually delayed our ability to really get started on it until much later. And we ended up with a very compressed timeline that I will definitely revise next year. We did bring writers aboard. And for the most part, we look at our places in a similar way that you described, Dan, but we do try to assign to writers who have a very strong familiarity and context for the places that they're writing about, especially when these places are a little bit off the beaten track. I do think that it's really important to be able to assess the value of the news that's coming into a place and what that means for the landscape and how the place is changing in the coming year. So we do have a real mindfulness towards that. And as far as looking at other lists, we just wanted our list to be different in its format more so than in the places the news is the news. So the things that excite a lot of us for a reason, and there's going to be overlap naturally. But we wanted to make sure that we approached the list with a sensibility that was very, endemic to Bloomberg as a brand. A lot of our readers are in the business profession, and they are very data savvy and data minded. So we layered on, different pieces of information. We did hotel pricing from Google, looking at average prices each month of the year. And then we also got insights from travel specialists who know those destinations, who recommended this is the best time to go, this is the worst time to go. And that kind of added a service component that we thought differentiated the list more so than the places themselves.
Was there a difficult pick this year that, well, since you weren't arguing with other people, but arguing with yourself about including on the list this year?
Well, we actually over-assign the list by a few. So we actually assigned 55 places.
So what are the three outtakes?
I'm not going to say, but nice try. But I will say that the reason we do that is because there's always a few that once they sort of come in their final form, either the photography comes in and that's not very strong, or we read it and we're sort of like, it's a little flat. It's not, you know what I mean? It's sort of not what we would ideally include on the list. Obviously, in the literal sense, you could include thousands of places. I mean, there's stuff going on all over the world every year. But there are a couple of places that definitely on the list that definitely cause more discussion. There's always a domestic destination that somebody in the room is sort of like, oh, really? Are we gonna, like
Sedona, for instance?
Well, Sedona, actually, I don't know. I think Sedona's a pretty strong one. The one that probably has been, I don't know if controversial is quite the right word, but we put Detroit at number 9, which I think a lot of people have the reaction has sort of been like, really? Like, am I really going to Detroit? And my answer is like, yeah, you're really going to Detroit. I mean, I really think that one of the things, going back to your question, Hannah, about overlaps in other lists, we get one of the fascinating things for me is when we get overlaps in our pitches. So like when, a bunch of different writers pitch the same place, and not just because of like a single event or, a hotel opening or an anniversary or something like that. And Detroit popped up on a whole bunch of people's radar for various reasons. And I think, with places that are a little bit counterintuitive like that, I mean, everybody loves a good comeback story. And I think that's Detroit sort of falls into that category where they've obviously gone through a lot of struggles over the last couple of decades, culminating in the bankruptcy filing a few years ago. And it really has made like this incredible comeback. And they're not sort of, past their difficulties, but there's a lot of stuff going on there, and a lot of young artists and restaurateurs and entrepreneurs sort of, doing interesting startup stuff. There's going to be a giant new stadium opening in the fall. That's going to be the new home to the Red Wings and the Pistons. Beautiful art museum. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So that's one that I think that sort of popped up. And then there's also, obviously, you have to deal with sort of safety issues and things like that. We don't want to put anything on the list that's going to actually put anybody in serious jeopardy. But there are some other places that are probably not for your average traveler, maybe more for your slightly more ambitious ones. So like Gabon, for example, is a place that is relatively politically stable, but did have a very contentious election last year. And I think in those sort of situations, we always try to sort of nod to that in the item. They're very short, the items, but even just in a half of a sentence or something like that, just give a sense that, to give a little bit of context for people and sort of so they can go and do a little bit more research and a deeper dive sort of with that in mind.
We made some controversial choices, I think, to an extent. It's interesting. We had 20 places. You guys had 52. When you're looking at a smaller list, you really have to scrutinize each decision in a different way, I think. And that was something that fell on my shoulders pretty squarely. But we originally started thinking about the list, and we started thinking about ways that we could differentiate the format of the list. And one of the things that we thought about were, what are the types of travelers that we think our readers would fall into? What are those categories? Some of them are very intrepid, adventurous travelers. Some of them are business travelers. And then there's stuff in between. So we tried to pick different destinations that kind of matched those different travel personas and at least have a couple represented for each. And then when it came to the intrepid places, we went far out. We decided to put Iran on the list, which I think was probably our most controversial choice. But that was a moment where I did kind of think about other publications for a second. And I thought to myself, if someone else runs Iran on their list, am I going to regret not having put it on mine? And that was a good gut check in a way. It didn't matter whether anyone else was putting it on their list. It was just a nice way for me to take the temperature of how I really felt about it. And I asked a lot of people in my close circles, other travel editor friends or other people in the industry. It turned up that actually a lot of people are really interested in going to Iran. It kind of feels like the next Cuba in some ways. And people really want to get to places first. So we have to make that call. Who's going to say that it's the next place to get there first? So we took that chance. And actually, the news really substantiated the claim. There are a lot of 5-star, very luxury-driven travel operators. We highlighted Cox and Kings, who are doing amazing trips that really take you not just to the main cities in Iran, but off the beaten path. And I think that that's part of the appeal. So I think that was our toughest decision. And then we went for a lot of places that we think our readers are probably going to end up anyway, but they might not know that there's a whole new side to see. Places like Shanghai or Japan that a lot of our business travelers are going to be passing through, or even Miami for that matter. Just kind of saying there's a new side to this place that you might very well end up in already.
Yeah. Dan, you mentioned not wanting to send people to places that are unsafe, but I mean, if the last year has shown us anything, it's that we thought that Brussels and Nice were perfectly safe and they're not. Orlando, for that matter, Fort Lauderdale. How much does that weigh on you when you're making these selections and other, the possibility or the recency of other disease or natural disaster?
Right.
Zika, got to mention in your Sedona entry.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It does weigh heavily on us, and it's something we don't take lightly. I mean, we obviously live in a world where, it sort of, natural disasters, disease, that sort of, it falls into one category in a way. And terrorism is a whole other category because, as you said, it can sort of, it can happen anywhere, as we've seen. I don't think that we would exclude, we certainly wouldn't exclude a place because there was, a terrorist incident. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had Paris on the list, and the first major terrorist attack there happened like the week that our issue came out. And, but I think the reality of any major city in the world now is it's a possibility. So you take the same sort of precautions that you would, traveling anywhere in the world. On the other hand, there are places that are especially dangerous, and I think that we certainly have done stories on places. We have a spot in the list. It's a small island off the coast of Turkey, which has not been touched by the violence that has sort of wrecked a lot of that country. I love Turkey. I love Istanbul. A lot of our regular writers go there a lot. That's a good example of a place where I think it would at best feel sort of tone deaf to sort of include it, without a mention. So even this little island, Bozkata, that we included on the list, we said, we made mention of the fact that it hadn't been touched by the violence but the truth is, to get there, you still have to fly through Istanbul. Mm-hmm. So it really depends on what kind of traveler you are. I mean, the Zika thing, I think, has been sort of, in a sense, like a distillation of that, because it's so pointed. I mean, when people, we've been trying to work on a story on sort of like a Zika travel guide, basically, but it's such a moving target.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this constantly evolving thing. So you have to do sort of a risk assessment. I think, every individual traveler does. And I think you have to do that on a broader scale. But for us, what we sort of backtrack to is sort of two things. One is, this is not a checklist. It's a starter kit, so we don't expect, if anybody's out there who wants to go to all 52 places over the course of the next year, we would love to hear from you. But that's, either nobody or very few people. So for us, it's about inspiration. It's about giving people some ideas and some options. That's one aspect of it is giving people sort of a starter kit. And the other thing is to, as I said, to sort of speak to different types of travelers. So the truth is that most Americans don't travel overseas, and it's sort of a sad reality of American life, and there's good reasons for that. But most people don't use their passports. And so, one of the things that we looked at was, how can we provide a list that speaks to people, so like Nikki was saying, people who are, maybe business travelers and maybe going to tack on a few days to a trip they're already doing, speak to that person and speak to a person who's looking for a really off the beaten path destination that's going to require like 2 stopovers and, a investment of time and money. And I think we do a pretty good job of doing that. But along the way, there are definitely assessments that we have to make. And some of them are tough ones.
Yeah.
Nikki, when I think of the lists, I always think they're kind of a distillation of kind of where we're at now, kind of our hopes for the coming year. And so in that sense, and you can tell me if that's BS or not, but in that sense, as you were sitting down and thinking of your list, I'm sure that was around the time of the election and things like that. And we've also had, of course, security concerns this year, and also the value of the dollar versus a lot of global currencies is so great. What things like that came into consideration as you were looking forward to your 2017 picks?
Well, that's a really interesting question to ask an editor at Bloomberg specifically, because Bloomberg is such a global company. So something that we deal with in kind of a unique way is that we can't think about our editorial from a US-centric point of view. Whereas a paper like the New York Times, for everything that you guys are doing to broaden your center from New York, still has a geographic center to its title, right? Bloomberg, most of its readers are abroad, not in the US. We have maybe 40% in the US, I think is the last that I had heard. We have a large chunk of our readers are in Asia and a large chunk are in Europe, also in the Middle East. So really for us, we have to think about the big geopolitical issues rather than things like the strength of the dollar. The strength of the dollar doesn't matter to all of our readers, doesn't matter to most of our readers. So that's one thing. The distance of getting to places, Dan, you said there are places on your list that require 2 stopovers and maybe a full day of travel. I think about that for myself. I can't think about that for my readers. Just as many of my readers are going to be based in Beijing as they are in New York. So that's something that really kind of changes the dynamics of the way that we make our decisions. It also makes a difference as to how we describe our destinations, right? That sense of discovery that we often talk about as travel editors can really come out as being a very American sense of discovery. Maybe a lot of Americans haven't gotten to Sri Lanka yet, but if I tell that to my friends who are out in Mumbai, they're going to laugh at me. So the way that we think about our destinations as being either uncharted or undiscovered or problem-free or, free of conflict and other things, or value-driven, all of that is completely relative to the people that you're talking to. So we did think about...
Does that make it harder to get somebody in your mind as your ideal reader?
I think I have a pretty clear understanding of who our reader is in the sense of the lifestyle that they lead. But it does kind of make you question some of your own personal instincts sometimes and makes you think in a different way. In regards to this list, we thought about issues like terrorism, ISIS, the refugee crisis. We didn't think too much about Zika because, speaking to this lifestyle audience question, our readers are largely male, really business driven. So they're not always thinking on the family side of things, though some of them do. And Zika is just less of a concern, I think, for that demographic. So those were some of the big picture things that we looked at, and they definitely shaped our list. And yet we can kind of go more far flung in a way without feeling like we're alienating anyone for it being too far away. But on the flip side, we also have to be cautious that the places that we're selling are going to appeal to a global crowd.
We're talking a lot about your readers and the people who are going to be taking these trips. How much are you thinking about the destinations themselves and whether putting a place on the list will contribute to some kind of like fragility in their tourism infrastructure, or, if they're already struggling like Venice with handling the number of tourists that they have? I guess, like, are you worrying about the destinations themselves?
Right. It's an interesting question. We don't put a lot of thought into that, to be honest, in the grand scheme of things. We certainly think about it in the sense of, there are a couple of places on our list that, like, we included, for example, the Great Barrier Reef, which is a pretty counterintuitive choice in the sense that, like, my instinct is to say, don't go to the Great Barrier Reef because it's in a really bad place right now. But what we did was we had that item written from the attitude of how can one go to the Great Barrier Reef and help. And there are actually ways that people can do that. So part of me as a travel editor is would want to say, like I said, don't go. We don't want to put any more strain on that ecosystem. But on the other hand, if you're going to go, here are some ways that you can go and actually help out. In this case, sort of ways in which to help the native fauna sort of thrive. And it's always a little bit of a trade-off putting a place on any sort of list like that of sort of modest scale, because that there's a island called Ile de Porquerolles off the French coast.
Been there.
You have?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So I'm obsessed with this place now.
That's
because
great.
I literally never heard of it, and I was like, there's this gorgeous little Mediterranean island that I had never heard of.
Short ferry ride from the mainland.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's like a 10-minute ferry ride, no cars, beaches, vineyard. But of course, like, there's like 2 hotels. So like, if the list comes out, if you haven't booked your hotel in the first couple of days, like, you're probably screwed. Like, that's it. So places like that are sort of tricky. So we try to sort of have, include in the list places that are at that scale that, the truth is, if you're not going to get in on the ground floor, you're probably not going, with places that are just geographically broader, have a bigger infrastructure, et cetera, and places that are going to struggle to attract attention in the first place, and that we might sort of help shine a light on. I hope that we do that, and I think I think the combination of sort of having entire countries and list, big regions, and places where there are lots of ways to travel, hopefully we sort of accomplish that.
Nikki, what's been the response this year from destinations? Have you heard from any place saying thank you or awesome?
People get so excited about this stuff. It means a lot to them. And I think for our list, the strongest responses came from Sri Lanka and Peru. It's funny. I think this happens to you guys too. I think I've seen this phenomenon with the New York Times where whatever you put in the number 1 slot, everyone assumes that the list is ranked. Do you guys actually, do you consider your list ranked? Yeah, that it's ranked in order of like your preference.
Oh yeah, well, I mean,
is it not?
It sort of is, but I mean, I always joke that, like, when people are like, I can't believe this was 2 spots above that, like, as if there was some sort of like actual scientific, ranking system that we employ. I mean, we try, I'm sure you do, we try to have sort of places that are, we sort of have sort of a variety of stuff like through the list.
Totally.
And so, like, not having 2 places in Asia in a row, or 2 places of the same scale in a row, or things like that.
And varying the photography too, because you want it to be engaging to scroll through.
Yeah.
But anyhow, we didn't even have numbers on our list. We didn't number the destinations 1 through 20 because we didn't want to imply any sort of ranking. We actually made a pretty conscious decision about that. But Sri Lanka appeared first. We had a knockout visual from them. And we are very, very excited about that destination. But we didn't intend to place it on any kind of, higher footing than any of the other 19. Sri Lanka definitely interpreted this as we are number 1. And they got very, very excited. We completely embraced their enthusiasm, and we are very excited for them. So that's been kind of funny to watch. And Peru, I think, really responded to what we wrote, specifically the text, not just being on the list, but what we said, which was that this is the year to kind of look beyond Machu Picchu. And I think that also speaks a little bit, Jason, to your question about foot traffic, and kind of making sure that we're being mindful of the preservation of the places that we're encouraging people to visit. This was definitely an example where Machu Picchu has had way too much foot traffic. They threaten to close that site down to tourists pretty much every year. It never happens, but they threaten it all the time. And I think this is the year where people will start to just see Machu Picchu as one piece of their Peru trip. And Peruvians were so happy to hear someone cast a light on what the rest of the country has to offer. Right. They were thrilled.
One of the most gratifying things to come out of this is when we get, direct responses from people who live in places being like, I'm so glad that you included, even down to like a single cafe or restaurant or museum or whatever. And a lot of, we get them sort of, some cheeky ones where it's sort of like, thanks a lot. Like,
secrets out.
Yeah, secrets out, but those are by far the most gratifying things that come out of the list.
Yeah. You're talking about the responses you get. I'm wondering if you're just inundated year round with destinations pitching you to be on the list, and if that has any bearing, how much begging do you get?
We have big bags of cash in my cubicle that I just can't open. It's just not now. We do obviously get a lot of pitches. I look at none of them. Like I literally get an email and I delete it. I get a phone call. I tell them I can't talk to them right now. Send me an email and I delete the email. Sorry, but it's true. I'm happy to hear about your place. I'm happy to hear about what's going on. But the truth is that I just can't. It's just it's too much. I mean, I'm constantly inundated with stuff. B, I frankly I trust our writers, and I trust our writers to sort of sift through a lot of that, a lot of which is, sort of BS, and find the places that are actually is interesting stuff going on. The other thing I'll say is that, like I said before, these lists could be in the hundreds, if not thousands. I mean, there's stuff going on all over the world. So obviously these are sort of selective lists by definition. And I think that, we just, like I said before, and Nikki said before too, we just try to include sort of a interesting variety for people to sort of look through and not try to make this any sort of like, we do rank our list, and so it has this sort of definitive quality to it, but we also do it every year. So there was one I thought hilarious. I don't know where I saw it on a blog or something like that, but somebody noted that our number one place is Canada, but that Toronto had dropped off the list. And I was like, what do you mean Toronto? And I realized they said, because Toronto had been number 8 last year, they thought that it was like a, like
some kind of power ranking.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it was like,
actual
but
statistical.
Toronto went from 8 to nothing off the list.
What did they do wrong?
What did they do wrong? Exactly.
Well, Toronto showed up on our list, so we'll give
Toronto's
them that.
great. I mean, yeah, exactly. Toronto's, I have nothing against Toronto. It's a great place. And I think, Canada as a whole is very happy, so I'm sure not worried about it.
Are you being asked to defend Canada as your number one choice on a regular basis?
I'm being asked to defend Canada by Canadians. That's like, we did. My editor Monica Drake and I, yeah, right. We did I think a cumulative 24 CBC radio interviews, and then I did 2 on TV, Canadian TV, and a lot of them had this sort of like, really? Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah, we had this similar experience. Even Bloomberg's Canadian TV station called me in on a segment to explain why the city that was trashed all year last year, Toronto, was suddenly one of the best cities to visit in the world this year. They did not buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, in one sense, yes, but I think also there's a certain attitude of like, it's a little bit of a cop out to pick this giant country. But that's sort of the sell too. I mean, to me, the sell is that it's a world unto itself. I mean, besides tropical beaches, you can find almost anything in Canada. I mean, you can certainly find beaches there, just not tropical ones. But I mean, we have our interactive version at nytimes.com/travel. It opens with this gorgeous drone video footage shot in Tofino, which is a surf town on the western coast of Vancouver Island. And I don't think people would think of Vancouver as a surf destination. But cosmopolitan cities, obviously like an unbelievable array of national parks, great food, friendly people. For Americans, a great exchange rate. So, I mean, and it's the 150th anniversary of the country is sort of the big pegs. There's a lot of stuff going on across the country, especially in Ottawa. So to me, it's sort of like, I'm happy to defend it. I think it's a great choice, as I did last year with Mexico City. But yeah, there's definitely been a sort of a little bit of a head scratch.
I do feel like that's a nice example to show that, how differently we approached our lists in a way, because by virtue of us choosing Toronto, I think it does kind of speak to a fundamental difference in the way that we thought about places. But we definitely thought about destinations that were both countries and cities, as you guys did. But we kind of used our judgment call was, how will a person plan this trip? If a person is actually going to act on the information that we're giving them, what is the format in which it's most serviceable to them? Is anyone going to plan a trip to just one town in Japan? No. Let's put Japan on the list. There's a lot of news in a lot of places. Is anyone going to plan a trip to all of Canada? I personally don't think so. So let's give them the city that they should go to. So we kind of use that as a barometer for us. How is somebody going to plan their actual vacation? And, how do we build our package around what they're going to use most readily? That's not to knock anyone's approach in any way, but it just kind of signals a change in the way that we thought about things and the way that we approach things. I think Canada's awesome. And that shot of Vancouver was killer.
Yeah.
I like the idea that they're saying, aren't there more deserving places than us? It's
It's
so
very Canadian.
So Canadian.
Stop doing that, Canada. Get an attitude.
Yeah, we did get a nice shout out on Twitter and Facebook from Prime Minister Trudeau. So
What did the other Justin, who's from Canada, think?
Hasn't weighed in as far as I know, but I'm sure he's happy. You had to hear from Drake as well, but maybe one of these days.
You got time. It's a long
exactly.
year.
Yes, it is.
He'll write a crappy song about it.
Yeah.
Nikki, you mentioned like in Japan, there's news happening in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Did you feel like the common thread had to be that there was like some news going on or something newsworthy going on in the 20 places that you were picking?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure if same for you, Dan, but yeah, can you talk about
definitely.
what kind of news?
So yeah, it is one of those funny things where there's news everywhere. Every city has something exciting going on. For that matter, New York, where we are right now, always has exciting things happening, and the food scene is always changing, and there's new hotels coming like every second. But we kind of have to think about where the news amounts to a substantial change in the way that you experience the place. So in Japan, what that added up to was there are several new luxury sleeper trains and different train services that will take you to really small towns in the countryside that were difficult to access before. And coupled with that, there are a couple of new programs. There's a collective of ryokans, for instance, that's kind of building out all of these amenities that cater directly to American travelers or English-speaking travelers who otherwise would have a little bit of a harder time accessing some of the special things about those places because they simply don't speak Japanese. So that kind of opens up the entire Japanese countryside in a way that is very exciting and very new. And that's the kind of fundamental change of how you experience a place that we thought about as making a place newsworthy for the purposes of this list.
You guys did this thing this year with this is your first year, but the when to go element, which I thought was a really cool part of it. Where did that idea come from?
I've always been kind of obsessed with the ability to layer data onto these stories, these types of stories, and to kind of provide very tangible service points in that way. So this is just something that's always in the back of my head is how can I layer on this extra very useful information whenever I'm working on a big package. It kind of was the perfect solution to how Bloomberg Pursuits could differentiate itself from the other lists that exist out there. And again, it was super intrinsic to Bloomberg's, business forward culture. So it made sense for us as a brand. And we thought that it just added something really compelling. I've done things in previous roles and previous publications where I've taken, average hotel prices as a way to explain, this is the best time to go simply for the purpose of value. But sometimes when I've done stories like that, you might find that the cheapest month to travel is, to St. Bart's during hurricane season. Right. And that's actually the worst time to be there. So you can't make these decisions off of value alone, and our readers certainly aren't going to. So that's why we thought to kind of layer on advice from travel specialists who know those markets really well, who are coordinating trips to those places, every day of the year, and have them also, put in their 2 cents and say, this might be the cheapest time of the year, but definitely don't go then. And this might be the most expensive time of the year, and it's actually worth paying that premium or not. So that's kind of what we were hoping to do.
Speaking of data, Dan, what percentage of your traffic in the travel section every year do you think is coming from this? And already by looking at user behavior, what are people looking at the most?
So the first question, it's a huge percentage of our traffic. I think places to go last year was the 3rd most visited thing across the entire website. So it's by far the biggest thing that we do in travel every year. It's also, to my astonishment, it has unbelievable staying power. A huge percentage of our traffic comes in the first week, but people visit this list. There are still people looking at last year's list. Like it used to be that maybe a couple months would, go by and then it would dip a little bit, and then a couple more months it'd dip a little bit. Last year was like throughout the year, traffic just kept coming in. And I think that speaks to both the depth of the list, that there's so much to sort of, go through. And also that even though there are a lot of sort of pegs throughout the list to specific events or whatever, it's a fun list to just sort of spend time with. And even if you've missed X anniversary or the opening of whatever, it's always a great place to sort of go and just get inspired. What was the second question?
What are people looking at the most this year?
Oh, right.
Or are you able to break that down?
So we are. I haven't gotten a lot of data yet on sort of what people are looking at. And actually this year we sort of baked into the interactive a lot more audience engagement triggers. So will it be able to? So this year, for example, we did a whole bunch of 360 videos. Over the last couple of years, we've done these, we call them cinemagraphs. They're these sort of short looped videos, and they're actually very different. The cinemagraphs are these very sort of beautiful, placid, very visually driven sort of things. The 360 technology, which the Times has a partnership with Samsung with and has invested heavily in, is fascinating to me because the quality of the camera is actually not great. So it's not about like, I assumed when we were talking about 360s that it would be a lot of like big vistas and tops of mountains and that sort of thing. And it turns out that what works much better are these much more sort of intimate, you're surrounded by people, or you're in the middle of a museum or whatever. So like we have one, for example, from Paisley Park, Prince's old home, which is now a museum in Minneapolis. That sort of thing. Those actually work really well. But they meaning us, the Times, are very enthusiastic about figuring out how exactly people are using 360s. One piece of breakdown I can give you is that, and this was true last year, I think to almost exactly the same percentage. The online traffic breaks down almost exactly half and half, mobile and non. So mobile and then desktop and tablet are sort of, it's just ticked above half for mobile, which is incredible when I think about like, we didn't even think about mobile presentation even a few years ago, to be frank about it. And now it's incredibly important part. And actually one of the advantages to switching to the 360s from the cinemagraphs is the cinemagraphs, because they're short video files, don't work on mobile. The 360s do, and are actually sort of cooler on mobile in some ways, because you can take your phone and sort of move it around and sort of like piece the space together. It's just super, it's like a little game almost. You can try. I encourage you to try, Jason. I think you should give that a try. No, they're still cool on PCs because you can sort of, move around with your mouse. But anyway, we are definitely interested in sort of, how people get there. how they use the list. And also ways that we can sort of take it apart and put it back together later in the year. So like Nikki was talking about how that sort of when to go aspect of it, which is, I love that part of your list. And one of the things we're going to do this year is sort of do it in a slightly reversed way, where we surface particular places or groups of places on the list at various times of the year when it makes sense. Is that, you see what I'm saying? Like, so sort of like, ideal summer destinations, in say March when people are planning their summer trips, or, as ski season approaches, in the Northern Hemisphere, sort of.
And you benefit from having a big list.
And we do. That is true.
One for every week.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. And we can sort of deep link to each item, so we can sort of pop them up like on social media and stuff when it makes sense.
Okay. So the last question that I had was, are either of you going to any of the places on your list this year?
Yeah. I'll be in Myanmar in 2 weeks, which was on our list.
Nice.
So I'm very excited about that. That's the first one that I'm going to cross off, and I'm very much hoping to cross Sri Lanka off this year, maybe in the fall when Wild Coast Lodge opens. We'll see what else I get to, but those are the ones that are kind of set in stone right now.
Awesome.
I have one very probable one, but I don't want to say what it is because I don't want to. It's a story that I'm working on. I don't want to tip it. Oh. But there's one place that I'm on the list that I'm probably going to. I'll tell you the place that I would love to go back to, that I've been to, that like reading the item, I was like, it's Puerto Escondido, which is on the Oaxacan coast. I'm dying to go back to Oaxaca. I haven't been in 7 years, something like that. When we do the list, like I always get sort of a rush of, like wanderlust when we put it together. But then when the photography comes in, that's when I'm really like, oh my God.
It's dangerous.
Like,
it's like you have to have somebody hide your credit cards.
Yeah, it really is true. And like there are places that like I'm just realistically never going to get to, but I have sort of designs on. But there are other places where I was like, could I make it to Ryukyu, the islands in Japan? Like, is that realistic? Probably not. I have a 4.5-year-old, so I'm probably not going to Japan this year. But yeah, so there's definitely, there's places, and I might end up in Canada. It's very, very possible.
Yeah. True.
Be easy.
I could drive there.
You can shop there by
You've got no excuse.
Yeah.
Well, guys, this was really fun. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So we've been talking about places to go, and here's a place that Skift is going this year, Europe. We're holding our first ever Skift Global Forum Europe on April 4th in London. Find out about this and other events at forum.skift.com. This show was produced by Ben Glowy, who can be found on Twitter at visible_sound. Assistant editor Sarah Enlow provided additional support. To subscribe to this podcast, search for Skift on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a rating and a comment to help other listeners find us. Past episodes and a link to subscribe are online at podcast.skift.com. And this has been the Skift Podcast. Thanks for listening.